Most people are told a story that quietly destroys their hope before they even begin. That if someone is avoidant, they will never truly change, never truly commit, never truly meet you where you are. And over time, that belief starts to feel real because no matter how much you give, how much you try to prove your love, how much you show up with patience and understanding, the distance still seems to win. You feel it in the silence after a deep conversation that suddenly gets shut down, in the way they pull away just when things start to feel closer, in the confusion of being treated like you matter deeply one moment and like you're too much the next. It creates this emotional loop where you start questioning yourself, wondering if you're asking for too much, wondering if maybe love is supposed to feel this unstable. But what if the truth is something completely different from what you've been told? What if the issue isn't that they can't become secure, but that the way most people respond to avoidant behavior actually reinforces the very walls they're trying to break through? And what if there are specific strategies, subtle but powerful, that can shift this entire dynamic in a way that feels almost surprising when it starts to work? Because avoidant partners are not disconnected because they don't feel, they are disconnected because they feel too much in a way they were never taught how to process safely. Closeness doesn't register as comfort to them the way it might for you. It often registers as pressure, as expectation, as a quiet loss of control. And when that internal alarm goes off, it doesn't matter how genuine your intentions are. It doesn't matter how much love you bring into the connection. Their instinct is to create space, to protect themselves from something they can't fully explain even to themselves. That's why so many relationships with avoidance feel like a constant push and pull, because one person is trying to move closer to feel secure, while the other is pulling away to feel safe. And the more this pattern repeats, the more both people become locked into roles they never consciously chose, one becoming more anxious and the other becoming more distant. But this is where everything starts to change, because when you understand this dynamic deeply, you stop reacting in ways that feed it, and you start responding in ways that gently reshape it. The truth that most people miss is that intensity does not translate as love to an avoidant. It translates as pressure. The long emotional messages, the constant need for reassurance, the urge to fix every moment of distance immediately, all of it comes from a place of care, but it lands in a way that feels overwhelming on the other side. It creates a subtle weight in the connection where they start to feel like they are responsible for regulating not just their own emotions, but yours as well. And for someone who already struggles with emotional closeness, that weight becomes too much to carry. So they do what they've always learned to do. They step back, they go quiet, they create distance, not because they don't care, but because it's the only way they know how to breathe again. And if you've ever felt that shift happen, where everything feels close and then suddenly distant, you've already experienced this pattern in motion. So instead of trying to push through that distance, instead of trying to close the gap with more effort, more explanation, more emotional intensity, the real shift begins when you do something that feels almost counterintuitive at first. You stop over pursuing. You stop filling every silence. You stop trying to force clarity in moments where they are already overwhelmed. And this is not about playing games or pretending you don't care. It's about creating a different emotional environment where closeness doesn't feel like pressure. Because when you step back slightly, something unexpected happens, the dynamic starts to rebalance itself, the constant pressure they felt begins to lift, and for the first time, they have the space to actually move toward you on their own terms. And that movement, even if it's small, even if it's slow, is far more meaningful than anything that was ever forced. This is where a lot of people struggle, because pulling back can feel like losing control of the connection. It can feel like you're risking everything you've built. Like if you don't keep showing up in the same intense way, the relationship might fade. But what you begin to realize over time is that what was being built through constant pursuit was never stable to begin with. It was dependent on effort rather than mutual engagement. And when you shift out of that role, when you allow space without panic, when you trust that connection doesn't have to be forced every moment to exist, you create something entirely different. You create curiosity. You create room for them to feel your absence in a way that isn't threatening, but noticeable. And for someone who is used to always having that emotional pressure present, that absence can feel like a quiet invitation rather than a demand. At the same time, it's important to understand that avoidants don't open up Because they are convinced through logic or pressured through conversations, they open up because they feel safe enough to do so. And safety, in this context, doesn't mean constant talking or constant emotional processing. It means being around someone who doesn't react intensely to every shift, someone who doesn't turn moments of distance into conflict, someone who allows emotions to exist without immediately trying to control them. Because for an avoidant, one of the deepest fears is losing autonomy within a relationship, feeling like closeness will come at the cost of their independence. And when every interaction feels like it's leading toward a deeper emotional demand, that fear quietly grows in the background. So instead of creating pressure through repeated "we need to talk" moments, the shift happens when your presence starts to feel calm, steady, and non-threatening. When they pull back slightly and you don't chase, when they take time to process and you don't assume the worst, when you respond instead of react, these small changes might seem insignificant at first, but they fundamentally alter how the connection is experienced on their side. Because now, closeness is no longer tied to pressure, it's tied to a sense of ease. And that ease is what allows their guard to slowly lower over time. Not all at once, not in a dramatic moment, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways that build into something more consistent. What makes this even more powerful is that avoidants are constantly scanning for emotional signals, even if they don't express it openly. They notice when your tone shifts, when your energy changes, when your responses carry an underlying tension. And when that tension disappears, when your presence becomes grounded instead of reactive, it creates a different kind of connection that they don't feel the need to escape from. It becomes something they can stay in a little longer, something they can explore without feeling overwhelmed. And that's where the real transformation begins, not in forcing them to change, but in creating an environment where change feels safe enough to happen naturally. And as you begin to embody this shift, something else starts to change within you as well. You stop measuring the relationship by how much reassurance you receive, and you start measuring it by how it actually feels to exist within it. You become more aware of your own emotional state, more grounded in your own sense of self, less dependent on constant validation to feel secure. And this is where the dynamic begins to evolve in a deeper way. Because avoidants don't just respond to what you say or do, they respond to who you are being in the connection. When you are anxious, they feel it. When you are centered, they feel that too. And over time, they begin to mirror that stability in ways that might surprise you. So what started as a simple shift, pulling back from over-pursuing, creating emotional safety instead of pressure, slowly becomes something much bigger. It becomes a new pattern, one where closeness doesn't trigger distance in the same way, one where space doesn't feel like rejection, one where both people can exist without constantly activating each other's fears. And this doesn't mean everything becomes perfect overnight. It doesn't mean there won't be moments of distance or uncertainty, but it does mean that the foundation of the connection begins to change. It becomes less about chasing and pulling away, and more about allowing and responding. And in that space, something powerful happens. The avoidant partner, who once felt the need to protect themselves from closeness, starts to experience it differently, not as something that takes away their freedom, but as something that can exist alongside it, not as pressure, but as choice. And when someone begins to feel that shift internally, when they realize that being close doesn't automatically mean losing themselves, that's when they start to move towards security. Not because they were forced, not because they were convinced, but because for the first time it actually feels safe enough to stay. When it finally starts to feel safe enough for them to stay, something subtle but deeply important begins to shift beneath the surface. Something that most people don't immediately recognize because it doesn't look dramatic, it doesn't come with big declarations or sudden emotional breakthroughs. It shows up in quieter ways, in the pauses that feel less tense, in the conversations that don't end as abruptly, in the small moments where they choose to remain present instead of instinctively pulling away. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss it entirely because it doesn't match the intensity you've been conditioned to look for. But this is exactly where many people make a critical critical mistake, because when these small openings appear, the instinct is to lean in harder, to ask for more, to finally try to get all the clarity and reassurance that felt out of reach before. And without realizing it, that same pressure begins to rebuild again. Because to an avoidant, even positive attention can feel overwhelming when it comes too quickly or too intensely. When they open up just a little and it's immediately met with a flood of emotion, questions, or expectations, it can feel like stepping into something they're not ready to sustain. So instead of continuing forward, they retreat again, not because they regret opening up, but because the response made it feel unsafe to keep going. And this is where understanding emotional pacing becomes everything. It's not just about creating safety once, it's about maintaining it consistently, especially in the moments where progress starts to show. So instead of reacting with intensity when they lean in, you begin to respond with steadiness. You acknowledge the moment without magnifying it. You allow it to exist without turning it into a bigger emotional event than it needs to be. And this might feel unnatural at first because part of you wants to celebrate it, wants to secure it, wants to make sure it doesn't disappear again. But what actually keeps it from disappearing is not how strongly you react to it, it's how safe it feels to repeat it. When vulnerability is met with calm acceptance instead of heightened emotion, it becomes something they can return to without fear. And over time, this creates a completely different emotional rhythm in the connection. Instead of feeling like every step forward will lead to overwhelming expectations, it begins to feel manageable, even comfortable. They start to realize that opening up doesn't automatically trigger pressure, that being present doesn't mean they'll lose control of their space. And as that realization deepens, their willingness to engage starts to grow. Not all at once, but in layers that build on each other slowly. At the same time, there's another shift happening that is just as important, and it's one that has nothing to do with changing them directly. It's about who you are becoming within the relationship. Because one of the most powerful dynamics in any connection is the way emotional states mirror each other. And with avoidance, this mirroring is often more subtle, but it's always present. When you are constantly seeking reassurance, constantly trying to close emotional gaps, it creates a kind of tension that they instinctively move away from. But when you begin to ground yourself, when your sense of stability comes from within rather than from their responses, that tension starts to dissolve. And this doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you become distant or detached. It means your care is no longer driven by fear. It becomes steady instead of reactive, present instead of urgent. You start to live your life fully outside of the relationship. You invest in your own growth, your own routines, your own sense of purpose. And as you do that, something interesting happens. The relationship stops feeling like the center of your emotional world and starts becoming a part of it instead. For an avoidant partner, this shift is incredibly impactful, even if they never say it out loud. Because one of the things that often triggers their distancing is the feeling that they are becoming someone else's entire emotional anchor. That kind of dependence, even when it's unintentional, creates pressure that they don't know how to handle. But when they sense that you are grounded, that your emotional state isn't constantly fluctuating based on their behavior, it removes that pressure in a way that words never could. And this is where the concept of becoming secure yourself starts to take on a deeper meaning. It's not just about managing your reactions. It's about fundamentally shifting the way you experience the connection. You're no longer waiting for them to show up in a certain way for you to feel okay. You already feel okay. And you're choosing to engage with them from that place. And that choice changes everything, because now the relationship is not driven by need, it's driven by alignment. As this becomes your new baseline, the dynamic between you starts to feel different. The push and pull begins to soften. The highs and lows become less extreme, and there's a growing sense of consistency that wasn't there before. And even though the avoidant partner may still have moments of distance, those moments don't carry the same weight anymore because they're not being met with panic or pursuit. They're being met with space and trust, which allows them to move through those moments without feeling like they have to escape entirely. And in that space, something else begins to happen, something that is often overlooked but incredibly important. They start to observe you differently. They notice your calmness in situations that used to create tension. They notice your ability to give space without withdrawing emotionally. They notice the way you no longer try to control the pace of the connection. And even if they don't consciously analyze these changes, they feel them. And those feelings begin to reshape their perception of what this relationship is. Because now, instead of associating closeness with pressure, they start associating it with stability. Instead of expecting emotional demands, they start experiencing emotional balance. And that shift in perception is what allows deeper changes to take root over time. It's what makes them more willing to stay present, more open to engaging, more capable of moving toward a version of themselves that feels less guarded and more secure. But even as this progress unfolds, there's still one crucial piece that determines whether it continues or collapses, and that is how vulnerability is handled in the moments it appears. Because for an avoidant, vulnerability is not a constant state. It comes in brief windows, small openings that require a very specific kind of response to grow. And if those windows are met with anything that feels like judgment, pressure, or emotional overwhelm, they close just as quickly as they opened. This is why it becomes so important to recognize those moments for what they are, not opportunities to extract more, but opportunities to reinforce safety. When they share something personal, when they express emotion, when they let you see a side of them that is usually hidden, your response shapes what happens next. If it feels safe, they will remember that. If it feels overwhelming, they will retreat. So instead of reacting with intensity, you meet those moments with presence. You listen without interrupting, you acknowledge without analyzing. You allow the moment to exist without trying to expand it beyond what they're ready for. And in doing so, you create a space where vulnerability doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like something that can be experienced without consequence. And over time, these moments begin to connect. What once felt like isolated instances of openness start to form a pattern. The gaps between them become smaller, the depth within them becomes greater, and the overall sense of emotional connection begins to strengthen in a way that feels natural rather than forced. And this is where the transformation truly takes shape. Not in one big moment, but in a series of small, consistent experiences that gradually change how the relationship is felt on both sides. Because at the end of the day, avoidants don't move toward security because they are told to. They move toward it because they experience something different enough, safe enough, consistent enough that their old patterns no longer feel necessary. And when that happens, when the environment around them no longer triggers the same defenses, they begin to let go of those defenses in ways that feel almost effortless. And what you start to see then is not a completely different person, but a different version of the same person, one who is a little more open, a little more present, a little more willing to stay instead of run. And that version doesn't emerge because they were changed from the outside. It emerges because for the first time they feel like they don't have to protect themselves in the same way anymore. And when they begin to feel like they don't have to protect themselves in the same way anymore, something deeper starts to unfold, something that goes beyond just staying present a little longer or opening up a little more. It touches the part of them that has always been cautious about connection, the part that learned early on that closeness comes with risk. And even though the environment between you has started to change, even though they are experiencing more safety than before, that old conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. It still lingers in the background, quietly influencing how they interpret certain moments, especially when emotions start to deepen. Because for an avoidant, the closer something feels, the more unfamiliar it can become. And unfamiliar emotions, even positive ones, can trigger uncertainty. There may be moments where everything seems to be flowing naturally, where the connection feels stable and real, and then suddenly there's a subtle shift. They become quieter, slightly distant, harder to read. And if you've come this far, if you've already started to build something more secure, this shift can feel confusing, even discouraging. It can make you question whether anything has actually changed, whether all the progress was temporary. But what's really happening in these moments is not a step backward, it's a moment of internal adjustment. They are feeling something deeper than they're used to, and their system is trying to make sense of it. It's like stepping into unfamiliar territory, where everything feels different, not necessarily unsafe, but not fully comfortable yet either. And in those moments, their instinct may still be to create a little distance, not to escape the connection, but to regulate themselves within it. And this is where your response becomes incredibly important again, because this is the stage where many people unintentionally undo the progress they've made. The instinct might be to bring attention to the shift immediately, to ask what's wrong, to try to pull them back into closeness as quickly as possible. But that urgency, even when it comes from care, can feel like pressure again. It can make them feel like they are expected to maintain a level of emotional presence that they are still learning how to hold. So instead of reacting to the shift, you begin to allow it. You stay grounded in your own energy. You don't chase the distance. You don't interpret it as rejection. And by doing that, you send a powerful message without saying a word that the connection is stable enough to hold both closeness and space. And that message is what allows them to move through those moments without escalating them into full withdrawal. Because now, distance doesn't automatically lead to conflict or pressure. It becomes just another part of the emotional rhythm between you, something that can exist without threatening the entire connection. And as this pattern repeats, their need to create distance begins to soften because the environment no longer amplifies it. At the same time, something equally important is happening in the way you respond to their vulnerability when it deepens. Because as they start to feel more comfortable, the vulnerability they show may become more significant. It may involve sharing thoughts or feelings they've kept guarded for a long time, expressing needs they're not used to voicing, or even showing uncertainty about the relationship itself. And these moments can feel intense, not just for them, but for you as well. Because now, the connection is moving into a space that feels more real, more meaningful, and with that comes a natural desire to hold on to it more tightly. But this is where one of the most powerful strategies continues to play a role, rewarding vulnerability without overwhelming it. When they open up in deeper ways, your response shapes how safe that depth feels to them. If it's met with too much intensity, too many questions, or an immediate push for even more clarity, it can feel like stepping into something they're not ready to sustain. But when it's met with calm presence, genuine understanding, and emotional steadiness, it creates a sense of safety that encourages them to keep going. You're not trying to extract more from the moment. You're allowing the moment to be enough. And in doing that, you remove the pressure that often causes them to shut down again. You show them that they don't have to perform vulnerability perfectly, that they don't have to meet a certain emotional standard to stay connected, and that acceptance is what makes vulnerability feel sustainable instead of exhausting. Over time, this changes how they relate to their own emotions. What once felt like something to avoid starts to feel more manageable, more familiar. They begin to trust that they can express themselves without losing control, that they can stay present without being overwhelmed. And that trust is not built through words alone. It's built through repeated experiences where opening up leads to safety instead of pressure. And as this trust deepens, something else begins to shift, their perception of space. Because earlier in the connection, space may have been their primary way of regulating emotions, a way to regain control when things felt too intense. But now, as the emotional environment becomes more balanced, their need for that space begins to change. It doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes less about escaping and more about maintaining a healthy sense of self within the connection. And this is where the balance between giving space and maintaining your own standards becomes crucial, because allowing space does not mean accepting inconsistency or emotional unavailability without question. It means understanding the difference between healthy distance and avoidance that prevents the relationship from growing. And as you become more secure in yourself, that distinction becomes clearer. You no longer tolerate patterns that leave you feeling unseen or undervalued, but you also don't react to every moment of distance as if it's a threat. You respond with clarity instead of emotion, with boundaries instead of fear. And this creates a dynamic where both people are responsible for the quality of the connection, not just one person carrying the emotional weight. For the avoidant partner, this balance is incredibly important because it shows them that the relationship is not something they have to control or escape from, but something they can participate in without losing themselves. It removes the extremes that often define avoidant dynamics, the feeling of being either too close or too distant, and replaces it with something more stable, more sustainable. And as the stability becomes more consistent, their behavior begins to reflect it. They may start initiating contact more often, staying engaged in conversations longer, showing interest in ways that feel more intentional. And while these changes might still be gradual, they carry a different kind of energy. They're not reactions to pressure, they're choices made from a place of comfort. And this is where the transformation becomes visible in a way that feels real, not because everything is perfect, not because all challenges have disappeared, but because the underlying dynamic has changed. The connection no longer feels like something that has to be managed constantly. It begins to feel like something that can exist more naturally. But even in this stage, it's important to remember that growth is not linear. There may still be moments where old patterns resurface, where they pull back more than expected, where things feel uncertain again. And in those moments, it's easy to fall back into old responses, to question everything, to feel like the progress is slipping away. But what matters most is not the absence of those moments, it's how they are handled when they appear. Because every time you respond with the same grounded energy, the same balance of space and presence, the same emotional steadiness, you reinforce the new pattern that has been created. You show through consistency that the connection is not fragile, that it can hold both closeness and distance without falling apart. And over time, that consistency becomes something they rely on, something they trust, even if they don't fully understand it. It becomes the reason they feel less need to protect themselves, less need to create distance, less need to hold back. And in its place, a new way of relating begins to form, one that feels less driven by fear and more guided by a sense of safety that has been built piece by piece. And this is where the shift towards security truly takes hold, not as a sudden change, but as a gradual transformation that reshapes how both people experience the relationship. A transformation that doesn't force anything, doesn't rush anything, but allows something real to develop at a pace that can actually last.